So today I'm going to be teaching from an object, and in this case, it is this beautiful thing. It is a wooden paddle made in the western province of the Solomon Islands. Now this one was, well, my sister bought it for me in 2006, so I don't know when it was made. It's certainly not particularly old. And as you can see, it is an ornamental handle. So this would certainly have decorative properties as well, decorative purposes as well as simply paddling. But it would make a very, very effective water paddle. Okay, although I've never actually used it because it's far too beautiful. So yeah, it's lightweight. It's a very, very effective tool for getting around from island to island in the Pacific. As I said, this comes from the western province of the Solomon Islands. The reason I've chosen it is, as well as having massive emotional significance to me, it makes a couple of teaching points to do with human migrations and human behaviour. My sister and I spent much of our childhood in the Solomon Islands. I was there until I was 3.5, and then for 4 months when I was 10. So it is primarily, I suppose, personally, an object of massive emotional significance, and it's got these strings on because it hangs in the ceiling up there. But I had to get it down for this discussion. As I said, the first point really, first of two teaching points, is that because I spent all my toddler years, the first 3.5 years of my life in the South Pacific, I can never remember not being fascinated by nature. I'm very privileged in that respect. So, in case you're wondering, it's not as big as it looks. It's just nearer the camera than me. I mean, okay, that's how big it is. Anyway, I can never forget not being passionate about nature and wildlife. So I will never know why nature first fascinated me. But the start of it must be at some point in the Solomon Islands, because by the time I got to Britain when I was nearly 4, I was fascinated. And so whatever it was that turned that on in me, made me so interested, must have happened in the South Pacific. The reason this matters is this isn't just self-absorption, although there's a bit of self-absorption there. But the reason this matters is it reminds us, as David Attenborough has said, that all children are born with a huge passion for nature. It is something that we can lose, but it is not particularly something we need to work to initially acquire. Okay, we have to maintain it to help it flourish, but there's no magic wand you need to use to make children enthusiastic about nature. It's very easy for them to become enthusiastic. You just need to tell them about it. And another example of this is that my nephew had a really big, beautiful, has a really big, beautiful illustrated dinosaur book. And long before he could read, he knew all the names of the dinosaurs and knew which painting was which dinosaur. So that means he must have learnt the names phonetically from his mum and dad, and then learnt to associate them with the drawing, the painting in the book. And that shows that even long before he had the massive assistance, which is reading, he had learnt a huge number of things about different dinosaurs, far more than I've ever known. And it shows that passion for nature can be built very, very early in children, and therefore with a bit of maintenance, a lot of Attenborough programs, bit of a binge on National Geographic, occasional trip to the zoo, you can maintain that passion throughout your life. I think that's very, very inspiring. The second point I was going to make, and this is more about human culture and human history, really relates to this as a tool for travel. Now, it is a classic cultural artifact, and culture to a biologist, conveniently, can be taken to mean any behaviour that is passed on. It doesn't necessarily need to be, opera or art or music. It can be as simple as the ability to swim is culturally passed on. The ability to make a paddle is culturally passed on. Interestingly, this end, sort of the business end, may well be culturally passed on in a different way, and certainly for a different purpose to this end. Now, obviously, this is a handle, you can grip it like that, but it's certainly ornamental, and frankly, that bit gets in the way. It's quite hard to grip. So this end is very much, well, to an extent, an aesthetic, artistic piece of culture, and this end is very much a practical, this is how you make a paddle to drive you through the water piece of culture. So, interesting to think of it in those two ways. Now, human culture, defined as any knowledge that is passed on, has evolved and developed almost to an almost infinite level of complexity since Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa, and the current estimate for that is about 300,000 years ago. So it's an incredible amount has been learnt and passed on. I guess, we've all had phone calls from our elderly relatives saying, I can't get my laptop to work, tell me how to send an email. I guess that's one of the first ever examples of culture being passed up through the family tree rather than down. But anyway, so normally it's passed on laterally or to younger individuals in one's family and one's social group. Working the internet and the laptop is a rare exception. Anyway, this is a Polynesian paddle. This was made by Polynesian people. They are some of the world's greatest travellers, maybe the world's greatest travellers. And they only number about 2 million people today. There are only about 2 million pure Polynesian people on Earth. And about 3/4 of, a bit more, maybe 80% of them are expats living in, about half of those in New Zealand and half of those are in America, in the USA. So it's a very small number of people, 2 million, it's less than the population of Manchester. But they undertook massive sea journeys, starting thousands of years ago, and certainly in terms of discovery of new land, culminating a few hundred years ago with the discovery of New Zealand, which was settled something like 1300 AD, so only 700 years ago, first settled by any humans. Those Polynesians are called the Maori, but they are very much a Polynesian people. So, to quantify what the Polynesians achieved, they settled what is called the Polynesian Triangle. And that is a triangle of the Pacific Ocean. Actually, the real shape is bigger than a regular triangle, but its corners of this hypothetical triangle are marked by New Zealand in the southwest, Hawaii just north of centre, just west of north in the top of the triangle, and Easter Island in the southeast. And this triangle has an average length on its side of 7,700 kilometres. It's absolutely huge. It's not an equal-sided triangle, but the average side length is about 700 kilometres. This makes the area of the Polynesian Triangle, all the land of all the islands of which were settled by Polynesians, this makes the area 27 million square kilometres. Okay, it's 110 times the area of the UK. It's an incredible achievement that these people settled this incredible area of ocean, and in terms of where they were living, settled all the islands you find in it, using simply large dugout canoes without riggers, so like a native-built catamaran, if you like, and of course paddles like this. So this has amazing historical significance in terms of the history of humankind in the Pacific, and the history of probably the greatest explorers, the greatest ancient explorers there have ever been. Okay, just moving down through my notes. And so if you think of that the Polynesian Triangle, you can draw it on a map. Remember, the corners are New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. And although Hawaii was settled maybe 300 AD, we're not entirely sure, but that kind of figure, the two other corners, the two other extremes of the Polynesian Triangle are New Zealand, settled in about 1300 AD, and Easter Island settled in about 1200 AD. Okay, right. And that's sort of the history of the Polynesians and the history of the greatest explorers that humanity has ever seen. But one other thing to mention, and why this matters as an ecologist, because I'm not an anthropologist, we have just exhausted pretty much my knowledge of all my knowledge of the Polynesians. But the reason this matters to an ecologist is, to give you a bit of historical context, Darwin talked about the idea of the noble savage. And the noble savage was a group of native people living at one with their environment, i.e. not overexploiting it, being thrifty with the resources that environment gave them, and therefore thriving for hundreds or thousands of years. And there are examples of this. If you look up the people of Tikopia in the eastern Solomon Islands, very near where I spent my toddler years, in fact, they have lived for thousands of years on this tiny, tiny island without much environmental degradation at all. They've done a really, really good job. But this is not always the case. And to think of all of these, all native people as living at one with their environment is a real fallacy. That implies primarily, in my opinion, the main reason this is a problem. Sorry, I'm fiddling with the string there. The main reason this is a problem is because this is not the case. You know, in most lands that humans colonized, we often wipe the floor with native fauna, and in some cases native flora. A lot of the native plant species in Easter Island were wiped out. So when humans first got to Australia, we wiped out the giant marsupials. There were these two-ton marsupials, about the size of a hippo. There were half-ton poisonous lizards, a giant relative of the Komodo dragon. So, and then when we got to New Zealand, the moa, which were these giant flightless birds, were wiped out in between 100 and 150 years. There were 7 species of them. Some of them were 10 feet tall, and the Maori just wiped them out. And there are lots of slaughter sites, so we know this happened. And also, the Maori word for moa means chicken. So they regarded them as giant chickens. They were fast food for them. And equally, we should not judge that the Maori and the Easter Islanders, and long before that, the first native Australians, we should not judge at all that they did anything morally different to what Europeans did. We wiped the floor with our amazing megafauna thousands of years before. The only difference is that, yes, Australia was colonised before Europe, but the only difference between Europe and Easter Island or New Zealand is that we got there first. We were devastating the megafauna of Western Europe starting tens of thousands of years ago. There were 7-foot high giant deer with up to a 13-foot antler span on the Isle of Man until 9,000 years ago. They used to be found all over northwest Europe. We wiped them out. We wiped out the mammoths in Europe. We wiped out the straight-tusked elephant in Europe. The cave bear, the woolly rhino, etc., etc. We wiped them all out. And this is the classic historical point you get when humans turn up in an area is we start killing the profitable animals to hunt. It's really, really sad. So the idea of the noble savage does not exist, broadly speaking. Obviously the word savage is completely unacceptable now, but it was a phrase that Darwin used. But the idea of native peoples living at one with their environment is really, really rare, sadly. Okay. Almost every civilization has wiped out its large fauna, and the exceptions are the beautiful animals that we have left, such as the rhino, the elephant, the many, many species of deer, the Komodo dragon. There are many, many species that are still very, very large. The scientific description of megafauna, slightly arbitrarily, is over 100 pounds, so 44 kilos. There's loads and loads of animals left that exceed that. And we probably can't bring woolly mammoths back. We probably can't bring the giant Australian poisonous lizard back. It would have been about 6 meters long and quite fast moving. We probably can't bring back Diprotodon, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloth that went extinct in North America. We probably can't bring those back, but we can preserve what is left. And while we should weep for what is gone, we should also fight incredibly hard for what is left. Think of all those amazing species The polar bear, classic example of a threatened example of megafauna, this incredibly charismatic species. We understand the threats to it. They're not complex. They are hunting and climate change. And yes, you still can hunt them if you pay the Canadian government at least $10,000. It's amazing, but it's true. Depressing, but true. But we should remember the megafauna that are gone, these incredible animals that we will probably only ever be able to see in museums. But we should fight for what is left, because it is a beautiful world, and there is a huge, huge amount of splendour that we should preserve. And finally, returning to my first point, the more we enthuse kids and adults, kids of all ages is the cliche, the more we enthuse and inform and enliven passion in children of all ages, the more we and they will fight for conservation, and the more of a beautiful, spectacular world it will continue to be.